Imagine waking up one morning, stepping outside, and the sea that was lapping against your window yesterday is gone. Not receded by a few meters, not shrunk a little, gone, completely. Where fishing trawlers sailed just yesterday, there's now sand, salt, and the skeletons of ships lying in the middle of a desert, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest water. This isn't the plot of a science fiction film or an apocalyptic parable. This is a real story that unfolded within the lifetime of one or two generations. Back in 1960, this was the fourth largest lake on the planet, bigger than Belgium and the Netherlands combined. Yet within just 30 years, people in the town of Muynak, once a major fishing port, would look out their windows and see nothing but sand where a sea should have been. Locals tell a story that would almost sound like a joke if it weren't so bitter. An old fisherman would sit on his porch every morning and look toward the sea that once fed his family. The sea retreated so slowly from a human perspective, yet so quickly on a geological timescale, that no one truly grasped the scale of the tragedy until it was too late. Today we're going to break down what the Aral Sea once was, exactly how people, with their own hands, destroyed an entire sea, why it cost the health and lives of millions of people thousands of kilometers away, and, most surprisingly, whether there's any chance of bringing even part of this sea back. Stick around until the end, because the ending of this story isn't quite as bleak as it might seem at first. The Aral Sea isn't really a sea in the classic sense. It's an endorheic, closed basin, salt lake located in the very heart of the Central Asian deserts, on the border of modern-day Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. The word Aral means island in Turkic languages, and the name wasn't a coincidence. Amid the scorching Karakum and Kizilkum deserts, this body of water truly was an island of life, an oasis in one of the driest regions on Earth. Until the 1960s, the Aral was fed by two great rivers, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, which originate high in the mountains, in the glaciers of the Pamirs and the Tian Shan. They carried millions of tons of meltwater every year, crossing thousands of kilometers of deserts and steppe, maintaining a delicate balance. Roughly as much water evaporated from the surface under the scorching sun as arrived from the rivers. This balance had held for thousands of years. The scale of the sea was staggering. It stretched 426 kilometers long and 284 kilometers wide. Its total surface area was about 68,000 square kilometers. Its volume was roughly 1,100 cubic kilometers. Among the world's lakes, the Aral was surpassed only by the three largest bodies of water on the planet, outsizing even a giant like Lake Baikal in surface area. The sea had its own mythology, too. According to legend, Silk Road bandits once hid among its islands, using the small islets as natural fortresses. Later, in the 18th century, explorers drew up the first accurate maps of this body of water, marveling at its scale in the middle of what seemed like an endless desert. But the Aral wasn't some dead, salty basin. It was a living, productive sea. A powerful fishing industry operated here, exporting catches across the entire Soviet Union: herring, pike perch, carp, bream. The town of Muynak, in Karakalpakstan, was a major port hub with a fish cannery and processing plants, home to an entire fleet of fishing and cargo vessels. Dozens of smaller villages were scattered along the coastline, where life revolved entirely around the sea. Children learned to swim before they could confidently walk, and the fishing trade passed from generation to generation. The ecosystem was remarkably rich, too. Over 30 species of fish lived in the Aral's waters, including sturgeon, which had been here since a time when the region's climate was significantly wetter. The shores were lined with dense reed beds, the ecosystem's true lungs, where dozens of species of migratory birds nested, using the Aral as a critical stopover on their journey from Siberia to Africa and India. Scientists of the time even considered the Amu Darya Delta one of the most important wetland oases in all of Eurasia for preserving the biodiversity of arid regions. No one back then could have imagined that within just a few decades, this sea would become a symbol of one of the greatest human-made environmental disasters in history. It didn't start with a natural disaster, not with drought, not with some natural catastrophe. It started with a decision made by people sitting at desks thousands of kilometers away from the sea itself. In the 1950s and 1960s, the government of the Soviet Union set an ambitious goal to turn the arid lands of Central Asia, primarily Uzbekistan, along with parts of Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, into the world's largest cotton-growing hub. White gold, as it was called at the time, was meant to give the USSR complete independence from imported textile raw materials and become one of the crown jewels of the Soviet planned economy. The problem was that cotton is an extremely water-hungry crop, requiring enormous amounts of irrigation, especially in the hot, arid climate of Central Asia. To grow it in the desert, water was needed, and that water was taken from where it physically existed, from the Amu Darya and Sir Darya rivers, the very same rivers that had fed the Aral Sea for centuries. Massive irrigation systems were built, thousands of kilometers of canals, often dug straight through sandy soil, without proper concrete lining or waterproofing. This is a critically important technical detail worth highlighting on its own. Due to poor, rushed engineering, a huge share of the water simply seeped into the sand or evaporated along the way, never reaching the fields at all. By some estimates, only 50 to 60% of the water withdrawn from the rivers actually made it to irrigated land. The rest was lost for nothing, soaking into the ground or evaporating under the scorching steppe sun. Picture it like this. You have a huge bathtub being filled by two taps. One day, someone shuts off both taps by 90%, redirecting the water into hundreds of side pipes to water the neighbor's garden. Meanwhile, the tub keeps evaporating under the blazing sun. The outcome is predictable. The water level drops. Slowly at first, then faster and faster, accelerating over time. Starting in 1960, the rate at which the sea's level dropped accelerated with each passing decade. And here's the bitter part. Soviet planners actually knew about the possible consequences. Scientific calculations and warnings about the risk of the sea drying up existed. Some researchers wrote memos directly warning of catastrophe as early as the 1960s. But the economic logic of the time won out. Cotton meant export currency, meeting the plan, and figures to report to Moscow. The sea, in the bureaucratic logic of the era, was considered an inefficient use of water. It was, allegedly, just evaporating into nothing, while the cotton fields produced a real, tangible product. What's more, there's a view that some Soviet officials consciously treated the sea's partial disappearance as an acceptable sacrifice for the greater goal of industrializing the region. In this framework, nature simply had no voice. It's also worth understanding the purely political side of this story. In the Soviet Union, information about the looming environmental disaster was kept out of public view for a long time. Data on the sea's condition, pollution levels, and the true pace of its shrinkage was partly classified, since official propaganda was meant to showcase only the successes of the cotton industry and the triumph of turning desert into a blossoming garden. It was only in the late 1980s, during the period of glasnost, as censorship began to loosen, that information about the true scale of the Aral tragedy first became widely known, not just across Central Asia, but around the world. Until then, even many people in other Soviet republics simply had no idea that an entire sea was disappearing in the southeast of the country. By 1987 to 1988, the situation reached a critical point. The sea had shrunk so much that it physically split into two separate, nearly disconnected bodies of water: the northern, or small, Aral Sea, fed by the Syr Darya, and the southern, or large, Aral Sea, which depended mostly on the Amu Darya. This was no longer one great sea, but two separate, slowly dying bodies of water, each facing its own increasingly grim fate. The numbers from this period are genuinely staggering when you stop and think about them. Between 1960 and 1998, the sea's surface area shrank by 60% and its volume by 80%. Imagine, of four parts of the original water, only about one remained. In 1960, the volume stood at 1,100 cubic kilometers. By 1998, the sea had fallen from fourth place in the world by surface area to eighth, overtaken by many much smaller lakes. At the same time, the water's salinity rose sharply, from roughly 10 grams of salt per liter to over 370 grams per liter in some of the most isolated parts of the southern Aral. For comparison, ordinary seawater is about 35 grams of salt per liter, and the famously salty Dead Sea sits at 300 to 350 grams. In other words, the Aral was literally turning into a second Dead Sea, except in the middle of a continental Asian desert, with none of the tourist appeal or healing reputation. At such staggering salinity, fish simply couldn't survive physiologically. An industry that had fed thousands of families along the coast for decades vanished almost instantly by historical standards, within a single generation or two. Fishing boats that had gone out to sea just the day before were left standing on dry land, simply because the water had retreated first by kilometers from the shore, and then by tens of kilometers. There's an even eerier, almost espionage-flavored chapter from this period that's rarely mentioned. In the middle of the Aral Sea, there once was an island called Vozdrozhdeny, Rebirth. During the Soviet era, it housed a secret testing ground for biological weapons, strains of anthrax, plague, and other dangerous pathogens. As long as the island was surrounded by water, it remained a naturally isolated site. But as the sea rapidly retreated, Vozdrozhdeny unexpectedly connected to the mainland, turning into a peninsula. This raised serious concern among international biosecurity experts. There was a real risk that wild rodents or other animals could carry pathogens from the abandoned testing site onto the mainland. In the 2000s, with U.S. support, a special decontamination operation was carried out at the former test site to minimize this threat. If there's one place that became the most vivid, almost cinematic symbol of this tragedy, it's the town of Muynak in Karakalpakstan, an autonomous republic within Uzbekistan. Muynak was once a genuinely thriving port town. It was home to one of the region's largest fish canneries, with processing plants running around the clock, shipping catches by rail across the entire Soviet Union, from Moscow to Vladivostok. The harbor held an entire fleet of fishing and cargo ships, and the waterfront buzzed with life: trade, ship repairs, hotels for sailors. Now imagine yourself as an ordinary resident of this town in the 1970s and 1980s. At first, the sea recedes by a few hundred meters. Inconvenient, you have to walk a bit farther to the shore, but not critical. Life goes on much as before. Then, a few kilometers. Fishermen have to walk for hours, hauling their boats and gear, just to reach what's left of the water. And then, the water disappears entirely. The shoreline retreats tens, and eventually hundreds, of kilometers from the former port, leaving it literally stranded in the middle of dry land. Ships that physically couldn't leave in time, while there was still water, were simply left where they stood, stuck in sand that used to be the seabed, now turned into a hard, cracked, salt-crusted desert. Today it's an eerie, almost surreal landscape, photographed by filmmakers and photographers from around the world. Massive rusted hulls, some dozens of meters long, sitting in the middle of a dry desert, surrounded by camel thorn and sand dunes, kilometers from any visible water. Locals, with their characteristic dark humor, call it the ship graveyard. But behind this eerie, often photogenic image lies a very real, heavy human tragedy. A fishing industry that had fed the entire region for centuries disappeared almost completely. The cannery that once ran 3 shifts a day shut down. People lost their jobs. Homes lost their reason for being. What's the point of living in a port town when the port is no longer a port? Many were forced to leave. Entire generations abandoned the land of their parents and grandparents because there was simply nothing left to live on here. No fish, no work, no future for the children. Those who stayed faced an even more insidious threat, one that people rarely think about while looking at picturesque photos of rusted ships. But the sea drying up is really only half the disaster, and perhaps not even the worst half. The second part is far more dangerous, and it affects not only the local residents of the Aral region, but, surprisingly, people thousands of kilometers away. The Aral Sea's former bed turned into a massive salt flat spanning tens of thousands of square kilometers. It's already earned a new name, the Aralcum, a new desert that didn't exist on any map just 60 years ago. But this isn't ordinary, harmless coastal sand. Over decades, it accumulated the remnants of pesticides, agricultural chemicals, and mineral fertilizers, washed for years by rain and meltwater off the very cotton fields all this irrigation was meant to serve. The region's strong, near-constant winds lift this toxic, salt-laden dust into the air and carry it hundreds, and according to some scientific data, even thousands of kilometers away. Researchers have detected particles of dust from the dried-up Aral seabed as far away as the glaciers of Greenland, on the other side of the planet. This vividly demonstrates that a local environmental decision made in one region can have truly global consequences, showing up in places no one expected. For the local population of the Aral region, this means constantly, daily inhaling a mixture of salt, fine sand, and chemical residues in the very air they breathe. The health consequences here are extremely serious and well documented. The region shows significantly elevated rates of respiratory illness, including chronic bronchitis, as well as anemia, especially among children and pregnant women. Contaminated drinking water with elevated concentrations of salts and chemicals only compounds these problems. Some international health organizations have also documented rising rates of psychological distress among the local population, anxiety and depressive states directly tied to the loss of a familiar way of life, the cultural identity of fishing communities, and an uncertain future for their children. This disaster also has a purely climatic dimension, less obvious but no less important. The huge body of water once acted as a kind of natural thermostat for the entire region, softening the harshness of the climate, making summers less unbearably hot and winters less brutally cold by absorbing and slowly releasing heat. When the sea disappeared, the climate of the Aral region became noticeably harsher and drier. Summer temperatures now consistently climb above 40 degrees Celsius, while winters drop below -20. The growing season for agriculture has shortened as a result, and the very land that all this grand irrigation was meant to serve ended up less productive due to soil salinization and climate change. It amounts to a bitter, almost theatrical irony in the whole story. The water was taken to make the cotton fields prosper, and in the end, the water itself suffered. So did the climate, so did the very fields, and, most importantly, so did the people who had worked on them for decades. By the way, here's an interesting fact most people don't know. In the 1980s, NASA used sections of the Aral Sea's dried-up bed to test prototype Mars rovers. The landscape of the former seabed looked so Martian, lifeless, and cracked. And here the story takes a genuinely unexpected, hopeful turn. Because this isn't a story with an unambiguously, hopelessly sad ending, as it might seem after everything we've covered so far. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, having gained independence, decided to try to save at least part of the sea, specifically the northern, small Aral, fed by the Syr Darya River and located entirely within Kazakh territory. Two earlier attempts, back in the 1990s, to build a protective dam had failed due to chronic underfunding and flawed engineering solutions. But in October 2003, with substantial financial and technical support from the World Bank, construction began on a new, far more serious and carefully engineered structure, the Kok-Aral Dam. The idea was strikingly simple in its logic, yet genuinely brilliant. If it's impossible to save the entire sea, then wall off its smaller, northern portion with a solid concrete dam across the Berg Strait, so that all the water arriving from the Syr Darya wouldn't keep flowing out and evaporating uselessly into the vast, nearly hopelessly dead southern Aral, but would instead gradually accumulate in a much smaller, and therefore genuinely manageable, body of water. The dam, 13 kilometers long and capable of holding over 29 cubic kilometers of water, was completed in August 2005, costing roughly $65.5 million from the World Bank, plus over $20 million from Kazakhstan's own budget. And the results exceeded even the most optimistic scientists' boldest projections. Water levels in the northern Aral began rising far faster than anyone had dared to expect. Depth increased from less than 30 meters to roughly 42 meters within just a few years of the dam's completion. Overall, in the years since the dam was built, the water level has risen by about 12 meters. Salinity dropped significantly, and economically important fish species began returning to the lake, including a small flounder that locals nicknamed the miracle fish for the astonishing speed with which it repopulated the now fresher waters. As early as 2006, just a year after the dam's completion, scientists and journalists were reporting genuinely unexpected news. The fishing industry had partially recovered faster than any forecast, and catches were once again being exported. People who had mentally already written off the region as ecologically and irreversibly dead saw something they never expected. Nature, given even the smallest chance, began recovering on its own, far faster than any official projections. Over the past 2 decades, water levels in the small Aral have, by various scientific estimates, risen several more meters beyond the initial gains, and just in the past year alone, researchers recorded the recovery of several billion additional cubic meters of water. There are now serious proposals under consideration to raise the dam itself even further, to push water levels up even more, potentially, over time, approaching the levels that existed before the large-scale irrigation projects of the 1970s. However, and it's important to say this honestly, without excessive optimism, there's also a much sadder flip side to this story of hope. Only the small, northern portion of the sea was actually saved. The southern Aral Sea, the larger half of which lies within Uzbekistan's territory, was effectively left to its own, already largely determined fate. This part of the sea remains, for the most part, a dry, toxic desert, and there are currently no large-scale projects underway to save it. For Uzbekistan, the strategy taken was fundamentally different, not to recover the lost water, but to adapt to the new reality. Drought-resistant plants, chiefly saxaul, are being planted en masse, since their roots can anchor the shifting, toxic sands of the former seabed and help somewhat curb the spread of poisonous dust by the wind. In recent years, millions of saxaul seedlings have already been planted across the former bed of the southern Aral, and satellite images show areas that were until recently solid white salt desert gradually turning green. This isn't a restoration of the sea, but rather an attempt to limit further damage from its loss. There's another important, if less well-known, element to this story: attempts at international cooperation. Back in 1993, 5 Central Asian states that depend in one way or another on the Aral Basin — Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan — established a joint international fund for saving the Aral Sea. The idea was to coordinate the use of water resources from the Amu Darya and Sir Darya rivers among all the countries in the region, which have historically competed for these very same resources. Unfortunately, the organization's effectiveness has been the subject of harsh criticism over the years. The interests of upstream and downstream countries often directly conflict. Mountain countries are primarily interested in hydropower and winter water storage, while downstream countries need exactly that same water in summer for agricultural irrigation. This clash of interests remains, to this day, one of the main obstacles to a genuinely comprehensive rescue of the whole region, rather than just its most salvageable pockets. Today, Muynak, a town that once lost absolutely everything, has found something unexpected, a new, somewhat bitter, but entirely real meaning in its own tragedy. The ship graveyard has turned into a fairly popular tourist attraction, drawing travelers from around the world. Former sailors, who decades ago set out from here to fish, now lead tours, telling visitors the eerie and yet captivating story of the sea that walked away. Early ecotourism initiatives are gradually emerging as well, teaching visitors about the critical importance of careful, sensible water use. The story of the Aral Sea is really much more than just a tale about one vanished lake somewhere in Central Asia. It's a story about how a single administrative decision, made thousands of kilometers away, in offices where officials had never even once laid eyes on this sea, could, within just a few decades, destroy an entire ecosystem, wipe out the culture of centuries-old fishing communities, and seriously undermine the health of millions of people. But it's also, at the same time, a story about how even after an environmental disaster of this staggering scale, there remains room for partial, genuine recovery, if the right, sustained, and scientifically grounded efforts are made. The Kok-Aral Dam proved, in practice, that nature can recover far faster than even the most optimistic scientists expect. if given even the smallest real chance. The Aral Sea has become a serious warning for the entire world, from the gradually drying Lake Chad in Africa, which has lost over 90% of its surface area over the past 60 years due to excessive water withdrawal for irrigation and climate change, to the rapidly shrinking Great Salt Lake in the American state of Utah, where scientists in recent years have documented alarmingly similar processes. Retreating shorelines, rising salinity, and toxic dust emerging from the exposed lakebed, already threatening the health of residents of Salt Lake City. A similar fate has befallen Lake Urmia in Iran, which has lost a significant share of its water over recent decades for the very same reasons: excessive irrigation of agricultural land. Everywhere people decide that great rivers are simply an endless, inexhaustible resource for irrigation, the story of the Aral serves as a reminder of one simple but important truth. Nature always has a limit to its patience, and the bill for crossing that limit eventually comes due, sometimes within a few years, and sometimes across several generations. And that's the full story of the Aral Sea's fate. From the fourth largest lake on the planet to a tragic symbol of one of the greatest human-made disasters in history, and at the same time, a small but entirely genuine example of how even the worst administrative mistake can sometimes be at least partly corrected if it's acknowledged in time. If you enjoyed this story, hit like. It really helps the channel grow. Be sure to leave a comment about which other vanished place, extinct species, or forgotten phenomenon we should cover next. Maybe your idea will become the topic of the next episode. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss the next story about what happened to